Bob. Just get my stuff out of your way.
No problem. No problem at all. I always like to have advance notice when I have to give a significant presentation, and I figure that, 3 to 5 minutes is usually adequate. So here we are, 3 to 5 minutes advance notice. Where were we before satellites? Well, if you were like me, and you were in the backwoods of Arkansas, with a 50 or 60-foot antenna tied to the chimney of the house, trying to reach out and find something out there in the ether, you had one snowy channel, 2 at best. And let's face it, in those days there were only 3. So I had 2/3. That was before satellite. Now think about the cable TV operators before satellite. They had these 2 or 3 channels that they were trying to get over the mountain, through the woods, beyond the line of sight of the television transmitters. They didn't have much of a business, and they had a tremendous challenge trying to get where TV wasn't. So satellite came along, and Dr. Clark's idea of feeding the Earth information from 3 satellites. The intuitive comprehension of science that came from that man has not been matched. Like he said, sooner or later we'd have figured it out, but we hadn't yet. And when we hadn't, he had. And he did it without, rockets? Oh, you got to shoot something up there 22,300 miles into space. What are you going to do it with? Rubber band? Solar panels? How are you going to charge those batteries to keep those transmitters working? Transmitters? They got to be small enough to fit in a Volkswagen engine? Didn't have transistors yet. It's hard to comprehend what he saw and translate that into today, where we've got how many channels? 200 too many, and there's still nothing to watch? We got plenty for the talking heads to vomit on us on a daily basis like they do. There are days, like the last few days, I wish we were back to 1 channel, snowy. 20 reporters in the entire country. That's sort of like 5,000 lawyers on the ocean floor. It's a start. Anyway, everybody in this room basically is old enough, with few exceptions, to remember before satellite. You may have had all 3 channels, so you didn't notice so much, and they might have actually been clear pictures, which I didn't have. But in rural Arkansas, 40 miles from Texarkana, and all Texarkana had in those days was a translator from Shreveport, television was a scarce commodity. And then along came Bob. Bob Cooper, will you come on up? I don't think I have to give your quals to anybody. I think everybody here knows who you are.
Some people, Thomas, will think I wrote that for you. I didn't, and he honestly did not know that he was going to be introducing me until just 3 or 4 minutes before he did so. Good job done, Tom. Tom did almost live with me for about 3 or 4 years on that island that Paul sang about. That was after he was responsible for the sale of home satellite products from Maycom. We all remember Maycom. I want to begin with a quotation from a classic country and western song by Tom T. Hall, which, can you see it coming? Which I think very possibly describes what happened between 1979 and 1986, that period of time when C-band bloomed and turned into a worldwide phenomenon. Faster horses, older whiskey, younger women, and more money. 10 years ago, this coming September, most would agree that there were 3 individuals who owned home satellite dishes. Henry Taylor Howard, San Andreas, California. A gentleman named Rod Wheeler, who was living in a log cabin near Yellowknife, Northwest Territory, and the story of why he had a satellite dish is worth a book of its own. And me, myself, and I. So a few seconds of appropriate silence for Mr. Howard, in all seriousness, who is no longer living. And for Rod Wheeler, who is so busy trying to literally mine gold in a mining camp on the border of Northwest Territory and Alaska, that he couldn't be with us tonight and had no interest in being with us tonight. Well, the people in this room represented what I think probably would be the core, the central nucleus of what followed the Howard Wheeler Cooper experiments that began in 1977. By the way, 10 years ago was 1977, for those that weren't quite sure what year I was talking about. A handful, such as Orbit's Kenny Schaefer, who just was awarded a shirt, thank you, H. Paul, are chasing something called faster broadband delivery of television, which has, on the surface, almost nothing to do with satellite. A few have become older. That was the faster, remember it. A few have become older and turned into authors. I'm not one, I never was one, but I would like to mention a chap named Larry James, who is at home in Arkansas, I hope, watching this. He was involved in the Tulsa startup firm SatFinder, and he's an example of a number of our folks who, as they have matured, have figured out how to use a typewriter and have written some rather decent literature. Another group, and I'm one of these, I admit this one, have located younger women who will put up with our fantasies. And then there's, of course, the subject of more money. A gentleman who is not here tonight, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Hayden McCullough? All right. Is there anybody here who doesn't remember the Vidiarc 8-ball antenna? That redwood and screen material? And okay, that's Hayden. That was Hayden. He ran me down about 2 weeks ago and promised to be here, but obviously couldn't. And he said, guess what I just did? I don't know what you just did. He said, I now own 80 of the ex-AT&T microwave link hop sites that stretch from coast to coast, the ones that preceded satellite. See the connection there? AT&T worked their butts off to get television from New York to California, and then they turned around and they sold 80 of their 120-some sites to a man in Salem, Arkansas, who did his part to put them out of business in the first place. I said, Hayden, what are you going to do with 80 sites? He said, you know, there's land and there's buildings. He said, and every one's got a tower. He said, some of them are 360 feet tall. I said, I repeat, what are you going to do with them? And he said, I don't know, you got a business plan? Faster horses, older whiskey, younger women, and more money. Tom T. Hall was spot on. Another one who is here tonight, Intersat's David McClaskey. He's now the king of a consumer product firm that manufactures an item that is about as far removed from C-band satellites as one might wander. David supplies 80% of all of the birdhouses sold in the United States. Is that incredible? Go into a Walmart and there's a David McCluskey birdhouse sitting right there for you. Well, 108 years ago, that would be 1979. I'll kind of tag them as I go along now. Taylor and Rod Wheeler and I had infected a few hundred additional people. There were a few who got infected without any help from us, and that would include Dr. H. Paul. He had it all figured out, and he didn't have to get any lessons from a man in the Yukon or me or from Mr. Howard. The best studies that have perhaps been done say in December 1979, at the very most, tell me you agree with me, Paul, there might have been 200 private home dishes, if that, in the whole North America. 200. Well, they had to be home built in 1979 in December, because at that point there was nobody building home consumer products of any kind.
Blue boxes, Bob.
In December of 79.
Blue boxes, December 79.
You actually were shipping some then. Okay, I stand corrected. There was almost nobody building them. How's that? Thank you. I want to be accurate. I do want to be accurate. Most of those, using blue boxes, Paul, most of those would be grabbed up by people like Doug Dennert, my friend from Minnesota, who quickly turned whatever he paid ICM for that blue box into slightly more money. Doug sold his first hand-wrought system. Actually, he's going to precede this by just a little bit. Doug sold his first hand-wrought system using a receiver that came from Microdyne to a motel in Wyoming in mid-1978. That was about the time you and I were getting serious about this. The motel operator said, "What do you think's fair price for this, Mr. Dennert?" Doug said, "Oh, I don't know. I've never sold one of these before." Well, he said, "How about $15,000? The guy said, "Yeah, okay. And by the way, go back home to Minnesota and make me 4 more at the same price." Well, that story and hundreds more like that would be the epic journey that most people in this room took. What Doug did early in 78, we were all doing by 80 or 81. I say we all, the people in this room. And it was to some amazement that we could do it for less than $15,000. In the book that I don't have a copy of around at the moment, but which says C-band Remembered, it is recalled that one of the early suppliers in this industry for the cable end people strayed outside the cable market and the broadcast market just long enough to take an order for some number like 28 or 30 private terminals that went to horse breeders. And they had no idea what they should charge for these things, so they were selling them with 4.5 and 5 meter antennas for around $30,000, and the buyers thought they were getting a bargain. So therefore, Mr. Dennert, for $15,000, he cut the price 50% in just a matter of months. Well, it took us almost 5 years to get ourselves in real trouble as an industry, I think. It was in late 1984, according to a publication that I used to write, that we had visual proof and a significant amount of interest in 4-foot C-band dishes. Peter Sutro, anybody remember that name? Peter Sutro in New Jersey, Blair Gilbert in Pennsylvania. Both of them were installing in condos and multiple dwelling residents 4-foot C-band antennas and then wiring the whole place with L-band distribution. And that was pretty amazing stuff in 1984. So between Mr. Denner's 1978 installation and sometime in, say, 1985, we went from those 200 terminals that Paul thinks is probably generous in December of 1979, we went to over 3 million. Boy, did we create a stink, right? We got a lot of people really upset with us because we were just a little bit too good at what we did. And worse than that, if a 4-foot antenna was going to work, these crazy C-band guys are going to come back at the next year's show with a 3-foot. They just knew it. They absolutely knew it. In December 1984, this industry sold and installed 75,000 new systems in 1 month. That was the peak month, December 1984. Everything said it was going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and there were people who advised us that if we ever got to 5 million installed, we were totally unstoppable. And probably that was a true statement. Unstoppable in the sense that every one of those installations, and Paul's song said it very nicely, every one of those installations was totally illegal. It was in October of 1979 that the FCC ruled on 2 items. Number 1, you no longer had to have a license to have a satellite dish. But number 2, if you had one, then you better go get the written permission from each of the programmers who you intended to watch. Ted Turner did that. I actually did that. I have a whole file full of letters from wonderful folks at HBO, etc. They never wrote the second one to anybody, but I got one. The point being that from those 200 terminals in December 1979 until 1984, 1985, every system we created as an industry and sold was violating a 1934 act. Most of us knew that. Rick Brown, the attorney for space, knew that one way or another we had to be legalized or we wouldn't ever get to 5 million terminals. Well, the Cable Communications Policy Act of 1984 was signed by President Reagan, and it gave us breathing room. It gave us an opportunity to work out that there had to be some way to get programming that we could pay for and still stay in business. And as Paul's song said, the cable industry wasn't very happy about that act because it was a bill that was created for their benefit and it was modified at the last minute by an addendum, as often happens in Congress, that gave us also rights to view satellite programming. One year after all of that happened, that 75,000 new terminals that were installed in December of 84 fell to 20,000. 20,000 in December of 85. And by December of 86, we were in bankruptcies as an industry, and there was less than 10,000 systems sold. And that was it. That was it. We had 6 brilliant years, and in those 6 brilliant years, we changed the world. It's just that simple. Individually, for folks that never had television of any kind before, we forced prices down, we forced the equipment advances to mushroom, escalate, and we exported it. On top of everything else, we exported it. We had people like Bob Beher running all over the globe, sticking dishes in. And in that magic 6 years, we found out that we could do faster electronics, older traditions, younger ideas, and we could make a lot of money doing it. We were very good at what we did. In fact, that's why we got in trouble. We were too good. Arthur C. Clarke, after seeing all this happen, wrote in one of his books, and this is a quotation, "And so after 6 years of spectacular growth, the space cowboys were driven from the farms and streets of America, and corporate America sent in their attorneys and their legal documents, and the last great American experiment in freedom of communications came to a quick close." Unquote, Arthur C. We're the survivors. We have the memories. Some of us even have some of that money stashed away. I'm not one, in spite of Paul's song. I leave you with one final thought to something you can be very proud of if you were part of this. Dish TV and Direct TV started not in the 1990s with their KU service. They really started back in 1984, or a little before that, when the two names I mentioned earlier, Peter Sutro and Blair Gilbert, came along with 4-foot C-band dishes and said, what's this for big dishes? We don't need big dishes. And they didn't. They didn't. If they'd left us alone, we probably would have gotten the 3-foot dishes. But that's neither here nor there. We left DirecTV and Dish with all of the plans. We told them how to do it. We developed all the equipment. We even worked out the marketing programs. But they were just a little bit more legally bright than we were, and that's our legacy. We, as an industry, created home satellite TV. Everybody here helped do that. And we've changed the world. We have definitely changed the world. Well, this gives me an opportunity actually now to introduce our sponsor host for this evening. That's okay. Mr. Taggart, thank you for being my friend for, let's see, it's 11 years, maybe 12, and let's keep the tradition going for another score of years. Robert, please come up and
Well, I owe a lot to Bob Cooper. I think we all do. I will tell you that way back in the late 70s, Bob and I were working together. He wanted to license the dish that I had designed at Stanford, and we drafted all kinds of agreements. And none of that actually came to be, but we established a relationship. And then we lost contact. And 2 years later, in 1980, I called up Bob, and I had redesigned a dish that I developed at Stanford for C-band. And I said, "Hey, Bob, are you interested in a C-band dish? I've now got a 10-foot version of this thing." And he said to me, "Bob, I don't do dishes anymore. I do trade shows." And he said to me two important things that changed my life. He said, "Why don't you drag that dish that you've designed down to Miami? I've got a show there in another few weeks. I'll give you a booth, and you can set it up and you can see if anybody wants to buy this thing." I said, "Okay, I'll do that." And he said, "By the way," and this is the big by the way, he said, "Remember a fellow by the name of Taylor Howard?" I said, "Yeah, I remember. I met him when I was at Stanford many years ago." He said, "Why don't you give him a call and talk to him about your dish?" And I said, "Okay, I can do that, and please do that before the show." So I went down and talked to Taylor. We established a cordial relationship. And that was the beginning of Chaparral. So Bob was the catalyst for a lot of great things that happened in this industry. One of them was to get me to a show in Miami. I'd already started Chaparral. And the second thing, most important, was to establish a wonderful relationship with Taylor Howard. Because at that show in Miami, there were two groups. One was interested in Taylor's receiver, a group in Australia, and another group was interested in my dish but didn't have a receiver. So for that group, I said, "Go down to the other side of the hall. There's a guy by the name of Taylor Howard down there selling PC boards for receivers." And Taylor said on the other side to the other group, But on the other end of the hall, there's a little guy by the name of Taggart down there with his hands on a dish. Maybe you'd like that dish. As a result of that, Taylor and I started working together to show these two groups a satellite system working together with my dish and his receiver. And that really was the heart and soul beginning of a wonderful relationship I had with Taylor for over 20 years, started by Bob Cooper. So I want to say thank you to Bob, and I also want to say thank you to all of you for coming here tonight, to a salute to you. It's not often in history that a group of people like you and myself can all come together, create something that's a lot of fun, as we did over the years, and also makes an enormous difference to mankind. Big statement, absolutely true. You should be very proud of your accomplishments here. And I'll just give you one example. We all have our own feelings, and I know each of you knows deep down in your heart that you feel very good about what you've done being a part of this industry. It wasn't an industry, was it? It was a great experiment that was never supposed to happen. I'll tell you about my little story. My wife's parents lived in the southern, or still do, live in the southern part of Idaho, in the desert. I know you're getting the drift of this all along. They're farmers. They're rural folks in a very desolate area of the country. And they raise potatoes. Surprise. Idaho, it's all sandy soil, great for raising potatoes. Just a very difficult business. And we decided to install a satellite system. My wife and I decided to give them a satellite system. They said, no, don't bother. We're still getting 3 or 4 snowy channels from Boise. We're happy with that. Don't bother with that. Save your money. My son was about 5 or 6 years old. You're going to need the money to put him through college and all that. And we didn't listen to that for a minute. Found a wonderful dealer in Boise. Came out there, put a beautiful 9-foot spun dish. We gave the dealer a Chaparral receiver, Polaroid, L&B, and all the rest of that wonderful stuff. And ever since that time, every time we talked to them on the phone or we visited them, almost every time they would say, thank you. It changed their whole life. No longer did they have to sit there at night and complain about the ridiculous, unpredictable nature of farming, the bad weather, the bad everything, the prices, and you name it. It was a disaster, and still is, actually. But they could sit down and watch TV. They could watch the Grand Ole Opry. They could watch all the country music channels. My father-in-law is a great Atlanta Braves fan. He could watch WTBS and see the Braves. And they got national news. They're very smart people, just haven't had much education. But their life was enriched big time by a great dealer, by everybody that pioneered this industry, like all of you here. So my point is that you have made an enormous difference in the world. It started maybe one installation at a time, one family at a time in rural America. And then what happened was, over the years, people from all over the world came to our trade shows, Bob Cooper trade shows, SBCA trade shows, and so forth. They went to our seminars. I don't know. I feel so much a part of this industry. I didn't put on these seminars, but they went out to the dish farm. They talked to you. They talked to me. They bought products. They went back home, and they started their own satellite business. And I wish I could say that Chaparral had a strategy to march around the world that was well thought out and everything else. But the reality of it, like everything else in this industry, is that people from all over the world came to our trade shows. They talked to you, they bought equipment from you, they learned about what you had done so well, and we established relationships with so many companies and still have today all over the planet. First in the UK, marching across Europe, then big time in the Pacific Rim, enormous amount of business in Indonesia, a lot of business in the Middle East, same sandy soil, no potatoes, but they wanted to receive European television off the Astra satellites, Eutelsat satellites. And so what you started here has been enormously beneficial to millions of people around the world. And as Bob said, maybe there were 100 or 200 people in 1979. Today, there are hundreds of millions of people watching satellite TV as the result of your efforts here in this room. Those of you watching on satellite, and those of you who can't make it today. So, you have made an enormous contribution. It's not often that we can get together a group that has had so much fun together, so many crazy times together, and yet has really changed the world. So it's an honor to be here tonight with you. It's an honor to feel a part of something that we all put together. I mean, all of us working together made this happen. I would say to you, job well done, life well spent. So, after that, I wanted to share with you a couple of videos. One, we are in the television business, and this first one is about 7 minutes long. It is the story of the history of television, starting when it was invented in 1888 to its introduction. Believe it or not, 1888. It was only about 15 years after the invention of the telephone that TV was actually invented. So you'll see that up till it was introduced at the World's Fair in 1939 by Sarnoff, who really brought it. It was the driving force behind bringing television to the U.S. market. After that, we'll have a 9-minute video, a break in between, about satellite television pioneers. This is the Chaparral document that we produced about a year and a half ago, but has been updated to talk about the period of time from Arthur C. Clarke through the current era. So once again, the first document here is produced by Discovery Networks, not Chaparral. Don't claim to have any. We did edit this document to bring it down to 7 minutes to talk about pioneers of television. So if we could proceed with that one, I would appreciate it.
Wait, did you ever wonder how all this happened? How you can turn that knob and enjoy a dramatic show, watch the ball game, or hear and see news from anywhere in the world? Well, it's quite a story, the story of television.
The story of television. 45 years ago, when there still was a Dumont network, television was the new baby in the family.
One day through television, the entire world will stream into our living rooms with the velocity of light.
In announcement of its birth had caused great excitement and curiosity.
The producer is waiting at his microphone to speak his last word to the artist. The controllers are ready on vision and sound. The vision and sound are on. The station goes on the air.
Here for everyone to view, conjured up in sound and sight by the magic rays of light that bring television to you.
In the earliest days of TV, breaking the world into bits was done mechanically by a spinning wheel.
TV was invented in 1886, about 100 years ago, by a German undergraduate student. He got a patent for it, but he didn't get a thesis out of it. So those of you who are going to school ought to think about that. He invented a mechanical system.
Paul Nipkow was the student's name. He had the idea of using a metal disc with a series of holes punched in a wide spiral pattern around the outside. As the disc rotated, the holes moved across the scene, each one slightly lower. It was like spying on the world through a constantly moving keyhole. Once the image was scanned into a long stream of electrical pulses, it could be sent through a wire, just like signals from the newly invented telephone. By the year 1928, there were 15 television stations on the air in the United States spinning out mechanically scanned images. The first drama on television was titled The Queen's Messenger. It was performed before 3 scanning disc cameras. Herbert Hoover, who was then Secretary of Commerce, was the first American politician to appear on television, an AT&T hookup, live from Washington to New York in 1927. Little did he know what he was starting. Across the Atlantic, Scottish inventor John Logie Baird convinced the British to start broadcasting with a scanning disc system he had developed. In Baird's invention, as in the American system, the receiving sets all had spinning wheels rotating at the same speed as the scanning disc in the camera. By 1934, the British mechanical TV system was beginning to build an audience. But it didn't last. Engineers had already decided they needed something better than a mechanical system. For one thing, a 21-inch picture would have required a disc 14 feet across. That is where Philo T. Farnsworth enters the picture. Philo was a precocious farm kid from Rigby, Idaho, and he dreamed up an electronic television system when he was just 14 years old. He's now generally regarded as the father of electronic television. For the next 60 years, television cameras used vacuum tubes to create video signals from images. The light would strike the front of a glass tube coated with a photosensitive compound, and anywhere light hit, it would leave an electric charge in the coating. A beam of electrons, moved back and forth by electromagnets, scanned the tube from behind and turned the image into a stream of electric current. Philo may have invented it, but RCA's David Sarnoff gets credit for bringing television to the masses. He used the 1939 World's Fair to unveil television with President Franklin Roosevelt speaking on a live hookup.
And I declare it open. We're gone? Yes.
We're away.
All right.
That's good night, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Great job, everybody.
The
cameras, just terrific, everybody. Thank you very, very much, guys. You were super.
Thank you, guys, everybody.
Are we good night?
Okay, thank you, guys. It was terrific working with all of you. The ladies, thank you. Thank you, guys in the booth.
If we could pause here. Another pioneer of television not mentioned here is Vladimir Zworykin. He was a Russian immigrant who also invented electronic television about the same time as Philo T. Farnsworth did in Russia. He moved to the U.S. to pursue his dream and make it into a real product, and he teamed up with David Sarnoff at RCA. And Zworykin became vice president of research at RCA, where he invented the first practical electronic television system, doing a slightly better job than Philo T. Farnsworth had done. And this was the system introduced by Sarnoff in 1939. Zworykin received worldwide acclaim for his accomplishments, primarily because it was a great accomplishment and because he had the backing of RCA and all the resources to make it happen. The interesting thing about it from our perspective, and one of the highlights of the show in Miami in February, was that Zworykin, one of the heroes and one of the great men of television, visited Bob Cooper's show. And Bob featured him on the cover of one of Coop's digests, and that was I wish I'd had a chance to meet him, but many of you did. Paul probably did, and I just that was a wonderful transition. He was 90 years of age. He had a home in Miami and several other homes around the country, but for him to come to that show was a really big deal for all of us. So.
Can I add one memoir here?
Sure.
One remembers? At the Miami show, Vladimir Zworykin came to one of my seminars, and afterward he came up and in his thick Russian accent said, "This I never imagined."
Yes. As a matter of fact, he and I think you know this as well, he was disappointed with what happened with television, and he said, "I would never let my kids watch this stuff." But he changed the world very much in the same way that all of you have changed the world and made it a better place. Now the next video we're going to play is a Chaparral production of about a year and a half, 2 years ago, which is Satellite Industry Pioneers. It's been updated a little bit. Talks about the period from Arthur C. Clarke to the present day. This is 9 minutes long, and I hope you enjoy it. Old technology.
Chaparral Communications, celebrating a rich 25-year history, presents Satellite Industry Pioneers. This is the story about some of the people who brought satellite reception to your home and what motivated them. In 1945, the highly regarded science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke envisioned a stationary satellite ring around Earth that would allow instant broadcast and reception of electronic programming to anyone in the world. The Clarke Belt, as it is known today, contains literally hundreds of satellites in stationary orbit around the Earth, just over 22,200 miles in the sky. After the Russians began the space race by launching the world's first satellite, Kennedy made his famous challenge to NASA and the American public.
A clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth.
His urgent task speech was inspired by the desire to reach the moon and establish a viable satellite communication system, all of which he felt would contribute to world peace. By 1969, the United States had its first man on the moon and several geosynchronous satellites launched, capable of TV broadcast. The Telstar, CENTCOM-2, and Earlybird satellites were the basis of the first global network of broadcasting satellites. The challenge, however, was back on Earth, where the only way to receive satellite information was from large and very expensive dishes. In 1967, Dr. Bruce Lusignan, a Stanford professor visionary, challenged a class of 37 grad students to create a communication system for developing nations using satellite technology. Lusignan's vision was to work on meaningful projects that would make a difference to the world. His goal involved the development of high-powered broadcast satellites and thousands of small and inexpensive dish receivers. The Advanced System for Communications and Education in National Development Study, known as ASCEND, was considered a major fork in the road of development and had several reasons for its impetus. One was to bring effective education to all of the nation's primary and secondary school students and provide continued training in teaching skills, agricultural methods, health practices, and other skills vital to a growing nation. In addition, satellite could deliver an efficient communication system to coordinate the expanding commerce of the country and allow broadcast of cultural and entertainment programming supporting a sense of national purpose. In 1968, two of Dr. Lusignan's students, Bob Taggart and Jim Janke, were selected by NASA and Stanford to design a small dish receiver for the ASCEND study. The key requirements were high volume, low cost, and small size. At that time, a dish receiver system for satellite cost over $500,000 and had a diameter of 100 feet. A year later, after several prototypes and design tests, Janke, Taggart, and Lusignan tested their first small-scale satellite dish receiver. This dish system, capable of being built for less than $200, was the first of its kind and was featured in Microwaves magazine. In the coming years, NASA developed and launched the ATS-6 satellite, the very first high-powered direct broadcast satellite, focused on educational TV. In 1974, Janke and Taggart installed two of their 7-foot ASCEND dishes in Denver, Colorado and Roundup, Montana, and received television from the ATS-6 as part of a larger test of the satellite transmission. Other small dishes were also used on the test. In total, about 120 dishes were installed and tested in 23 states across the country. In 1975, the ATS-6 was repositioned to serve India, where it supported the broadcast of educational programming to over 2,400 locations scattered throughout the country. Dr. Lusignan's dream had become reality in just a matter of 8 years. In 1975, HBO began using satellites to broadcast programming by transmitting the Thrilla in Manila via SATCOM to 2 cable companies. Soon after, Ted Turner began broadcasting WTCG, later to become WTBS, to 27 cable companies. Now there were interesting programs to watch via satellite. In 1976, at his ranch in San Andreas, California, Taylor Howard, a Stanford professor and engineering hobbyist, built his own 15-foot satellite dish antenna, amplifier, and receiver, and began watching programming at home. Howard commemorated this event by sending a check to HBO for $100, believing that reception of programming was thievery unless it was paid for. Congress later confirmed Howard's beliefs in 1984 when it passed the Satellite TV Viewers' Rights Act, which stated that access to satellite TV could not be denied if viewers were willing to pay a fair price for the service. Also in 1976, a rebel by the name of Bob Cooper, editor of the Community Antenna Television Journal, envisioned the emerging market for the home satellite dish. He soon began publishing how-to manuals from Howard and others, and launched the U.S. satellite television industry by organizing trade shows. In 1979, Bob Taggart started Chaparral Communications in his garage, and the company's first product was the 10-foot version of the Ascend dish. The price was $699. In 1980, Taylor Howard and Bob Taggart met at a Cooper-promoted trade show and formed a partnership to develop satellite products for mass usage. Howard was elected president of the Satellite Industry Trade Association. He provided tremendous leadership and vision for the next 20 years to the industry he helped create. The Chaparral team of managers, designers, engineers, and sales professionals grew the company to over 200 people and $50 million in global annual sales of component parts for satellite reception. As the 1980s ended, the sales of satellite dishes exploded with the launch of smaller, much less expensive units. This happened first in Europe with the launch of Rupert Murdoch's B-Sky B on the Astra 1 satellite in 1989, followed by digital services of DirecTV in 1994, and then by the Dish Network launched in 1996 by satellite pioneer and visionary Charlie Ergen. Now, millions could afford to enjoy the benefits of satellite TV. Now in its 25th year, after the untimely passing of Taylor Howard, Bob Taggart continues to lead Chaparral Communications in developing components for the satellite industry. The company focuses on international markets, spreading the initial vision of satellite technology as a positive human impact to regions where satellite can provide the largest benefit. Over its life, Chaparral can claim that its satellite components and parts are being used in virtually every country on the globe, and the Chaparral name is regarded as one of the best-known brands in the satellite business. Microwaves and RF Magazine paid honor to two of the pioneers in the satellite industry in the July 1996 issue. The tribute states, "Nearly 26 years ago, two doctoral candidates at Stanford University, James Janke and Robert Taggart, designed a $200 satellite communications earth station to receive 2.62 gigahertz signals. This system was in many ways a forerunner of modern direct digital satellite services." Chaparral Communications, a storied history with a legacy of satellite